Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader, and we have another great guest today. And for such episodes, I always add a disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against a guest's political views or groups they support, but these episodes are for anybody of any political belief, and our guest runs a nonpartisan organization anyway. But government can feel and often is obscure and difficult to really keep tabs on. And that's not just because information can be hard or time consuming to research or we don't know where to look, but because officials, candidates, and interest groups can also purposely make things harder to understand and hinder our ability to tell government officials what we want. And hampering government transparency and accountability is a major challenge in today's politics. But what if there is a better, easier way to hold government more accountable and make it more transparent? Well, that's where today's guest, Ramon Perez, comes in. Ramon is the executive director of the Digital Democracy Project, DDP, a mobile voting app and online accountability system that not only tells you how legislators vote on bills, but allows you, the citizen, to tell legislators how you want them to vote. He also concurrently serves as the Director of AI Solutions for Elder Research and the Executive Director of Rank My Vote Florida. And Ramon is also a military veteran, reaching the rank of Captain in the U.S. Air Force and Major in the U.S. Air Force Reserve. So now let's get some insights into this Digital Democracy Project and the wider field of government accountability and transparency. Please welcome Ramon Perez to the show. Ramon, thank you for being here. How are you? And also, thank you very much for your military service.
Well, thank you for having me, Paul. I really do appreciate being on the show. And as fellow Floridian, it's always good to talk to another Florida boy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I always get excited whenever I come across somebody in this work that's a fellow Floridian. But I like to get back to the very beginning of things with my guests. So let's get back to the work. Before all the work you are doing now, what got you involved in efforts in the first place to improve government transparency and accountability?
I think as you mentioned, I was a military officer for many years, served in combat zones in Afghanistan, Iraq, South America, did a tour in Korea, and I always saw service as just an important part of my life. I came from a military family as well. And after I left the military, I think that a big catalyst for me was probably January 6th, because it felt like you had a large group of people who were feeling so dispossessed and feeling that the government was no longer accountable, that they took it upon themselves to basically storm the Capitol. And I think I was a bit shocked by the whole scene, the whole experience, because for me, I felt like we'd spent the last 20 some years trying to build democracies in the Middle East. And here we were watching it under strain in our own country. And that really hurts. I think for somebody who's actually lost friends in other parts of the world, it's hard to swallow the feeling like we couldn't even talk to each other anymore. I think I felt a similar way, like if you remember the situation in Portland, Oregon during Black Lives Matter and COVID, and basically the city government just sort of evaporated and let sort of an anarchist group, if you will, take over control of the city. And I visited Portland in 2021, and I was really quite shocked at what I saw there. It was reminiscent of a lot of war-torn places I'd been to. It, sort of bombed out, boarded up, just in a complete state of disrepair. And I think it's told me that there is something deep that needs to be addressed in the structural problems that we have in our government, in this feeling that people have that the system is no longer accountable to them and they have no say in the process. And they're resorting to sort of violent activities or overthrow as their frustrations become insurmountable.
Yeah, I feel like, obviously for me as a regular citizen, I was never cut out from the military. So I always have great respect for guys like you who get into that line of work. But especially as a veteran, more so than just a regular citizen, seeing, you're fighting for all these freedoms that we have here at home. And then it sometimes feels like they're still under siege in some ways. And
Hmm.
obviously, some of these, or obviously these, you bring up January 6th and Portland. Obviously, that is not the way to handle things, but it does shine a light on the fact that we do have a serious issue with government transparency and accountability. And that's
Right.
even though, ours, where we think the source of that lack of transparency and accountability can be different, there is, oddly enough, sort of a unifying theme where people across the political spectrum feel like
I think
government
that's
is
right.
not working
Yeah,
for them.
I
Yeah.
think that's right.
And, but yeah, it's something that's particularly important to me too. And then, of course, for you with the work you're doing and being a military veteran, I imagine it's exponentially more important to you. So I can really appreciate why you came to do this work you're doing now. So let's go ahead and get into more of the specific work that you're doing now. So
Hmm.
the Digital Democracy Project, I briefly described it in the intro, but obviously like to hear it in your own words. So why was it founded and how did you come to join it? And what exactly does Digital Democracy Project do?
Yeah, the basic idea is that we're trying to use disruptive technology to give people back more control over their government. I happen to, because I've been now working in AI and machine learning for the last dozen years, having left active duty, I got connected to people working in various parts of the technology world, if you will, and blockchain and biometrics and cryptography, mobile authentication, things like this. Got introduced to the CEO of Votes, and Votes makes mobile voting software for military voters overseas to vote from their phone when it's very difficult to get an absentee ballot through the mail. And as you can imagine, if you're in a submarine under the water, it's kind of tough to get mail in
Yeah.
and out, or in the Horn of Africa, in a forward deployed location. I mean, it's like it's tough to vote, and I've been in that situation myself. So I had immediately resonated with this particular use case, but I said, look, if you can securely guarantee that somebody is a voter because you match their photo ID against a selfie scan, you find them on the voter file, they're a US citizen, they're a resident of the state. You have this whole blockchain back end so that a vote token is cast. So you guarantee that a vote can't be manipulated. The vote that's cast is the vote that's counted in all this cryptography process in the middle to protect the secret ballot so the voter still has the right to privacy over their secret ballot. If you could do all of those things to let people vote from their phones, then why should we have to wait every 4 years, to engage, or every 2 years with congressional to engage in our government? Why shouldn't we be able to build a system that's like the Netflix of government, where government is on demand and I can engage in government all the time? So that was the basic idea that we developed, and we stood up Digital Democracy Project, went into beta testing in 2022. But the premise is this: we're using real mobile voting software that's being used in real elections in different parts of the United States and Canada right now. But we're loading bills that are being debated as they're going through the process in the legislative chamber so that people can weigh in on, read the bills for themselves and make an informed decision on where they stand on that policy and weigh in using this election software. But we provide the results to their legislators in real time as the legislative chambers are proceeding with their debates, so that our representatives can see what their districts want. They can trust that that's somebody who's actually in their district because we verify people against the voter file, and that they can use that to make a difficult decision in the Capitol so that they can best represent their districts. And at the end of the session, what we do is we compare what do the voters want in the app with what did the legislators do on the floor of the chamber, so that the voters can actually see, well, okay, we provided our input, we took the time and energy to educate ourselves on these topics and let our legislators know what we believe, but now we want some accountability in return for our efforts, right? So we want to be able to see how often are they doing what the district wanted, and every legislator gets a scorecard that compares all the bills that we've carried, which is hundreds of bills at this point for the Florida legislature, all the bills we've carried, what the voters wanted, what the legislators did, and how often they match it. And for a single bill, you'd say, okay, well, if a legislator goes against their district, whatever, no big deal. It's one bill out of many. But over the course of a long time, you start to get a trend, and you'll start to see legislators separate from each other to see who's the most responsive. What we're ultimately after here is that voters can go to the polling place in November with some concrete data to use to decide, do I want to reelect this person, or do I want to give their competitor a chance to maybe better represent me than the current guy who's in office? So that's the basic idea of what we're after here. We set it up as a nonprofit because we want it to be clear that we don't take a stake. We're just building a platform. We don't have a position on these policies, and we don't put our thumb on the scales. We don't have, some investor who's got some vested interest in whatever policy trying to manipulate data or sell people's data or sell the entire organization to Google or Facebook or whoever. So we intentionally established this as a public service by being a nonprofit, and by also using high grade, highly secure mobile software to do this in a way that we can have some veracity in the results.
That is so fascinating. I mean, there's so many things I wish I could address in that and what you just said there, but I think it's also really cool that you already addressed a couple of, I imagine, like immediate, trying to think of pushbacks. I can't think of the exact word, but
Yeah,
somebody
concerns,
might
critiques.
yeah, but they might say, oh well, how long does it take for these legislators to see the information? Well, you said it's updated in real time, and
Mhm.
it's just, and is it secure? Is it easily manipulated? Well, no, because of all these reasons. This information is out there already, but it's so hard and so time consuming to find all that
Right.
information. You have to go to all these websites, say, okay, how did they vote on this? But then also you need to know, well, what does this bill say? Because these bills can be very
Yes.
dense.
Yes.
And we all have these different heuristics we use to try to think about who we're going to vote for in these polls. And a lot of times we just fall back on, well, what's their party, or are
Exactly.
they an incumbent? But this kind of thing can really change the game and say, well, no, all those specific bills you really wanted, well, here's what they voted on. And, they can look at that easily, regardless of what their political views are. So I think that's really incredible. And
Yeah.
anything that makes, not just for the sake of transparency and accountability, but just that anything that closes that ballot information gap is something that automatically intrigues me. So that's really fantastic work to hear about. But of course,
Absolutely.
since oh yeah, go ahead.
Paul, I want to also echo a couple things that you just said, because we do work with another great group called Open States, which is an
Mm,
initiative to scrape the content of all the state legislative websites so you can actually get vote records on every bill. And they've been a fantastic partner. And that's how because you say you can go to the Florida Senate website, you can go to the Florida House, .gov. The challenge is that you have to sift through a mountain of data to actually figure out how your legislator voted on a specific bill. It's not trivial. The other
yeah.
thing too is that we're fortunate that we're at this, we've got this incredibly powerful new technology that we've really been leaning on, called AI, and it has the ability to take these complex pieces of legislation and really break it down into its component parts and make it understandable. So we've got a chatbot on our website where you can actually we preload all the bill text itself, so that if you go and you look at a specific bill and you want more details about the legislative language, you could read through the 1,000 pages if you want. We do provide links to the source, so you can go to the Florida Senate, but we prefetch all that data and load it into the system so that the chatbot can actually say, yeah, in this particular section, you can see how it affects privacy rights, or you can see how it affects homeowners associations, whatever the case. And you can get the level of detail and understanding that you desire, that's beyond just the summary and the surface level understanding. So AI has been an enormous game changer in just lowering that information barrier that a lot of people have, because they'll often say to me, well, I hire a representative to really dig into the details so I don't have to. Basically, this person is supposed to be really good at understanding these policies. And what I try to let people know is that now we have the technology so that you can become much more of an expert than you realized. And one of the things you got to realize too, somebody like you, Paul, who's actually worked in government for quite a while, a lot of legislators don't actually read the bills. Like, they just don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's so many of them that they don't, like, the 2,000 bills get drafted in the Florida legislature every year. of those, maybe 50 will get a vote on the floor. They can't read all. They're not going to stay current on everything anyway, and they're so short staffed. Most of them are sharing legislative assistants, so they don't even necessarily have enough staff to deal with the level of technical complexity. So a lot of lobbyists end up writing the bills, and people just vote on party lines for the most part. So I try to let people know that that barrier to entry is not as high as you believe it is.
That's awesome. You bringing it up just made me think. Shameless plug for one of the other things I do is I also, and I got to do this last year for a public affairs organization. I have a webinar I do about basically how to most effectively read legislation, especially if you're working for a client in particular, or if you want to know it for yourself and your organization, how you read these bills and what are the things that you need to know about when you're reading bills, like how people have interpreted them in the past and stuff like that. So that's something that automatically intrigues me too. And anything to make these things more accessible is something that automatically catches my attention.
Hmm.
Of course, it's not just about the idea of DDP and its noble ideals. People must actually use it. So, what are some of the statistics on the usage of DDP, whether it's how many people have used it, how many states it's in, and who are some notable political figures and organizations across the political spectrum that can vouch for Digital Democracy Project?
Yeah, so we've verified about 24,000 people against a voter file with photo ID match, about 120,000 or so ballots cast so far. A ballot in this case would be somebody says, I agree with this piece of legislation or I disagree with this piece of legislation, right? So about 120,000 of those cast so far. We've had, if you go on digitaldemocracyproject.org and look at our supporters list, you'll see that there are legislators and candidates across the political spectrum. We had early support from Republicans in the legislature who actually drafted and got a bipartisan appropriations request pushed through the legislative process. And so sponsored by a gentleman named Keith Perry, who was a senior senator out of Ocala, Jim Mooney, who was a Republican out of the Keys, and then Rita Harris, who was a junior Democrat out of Central Florida, and Senator Torres, who was a senior Democratic senator out of Central Florida as well. And so they worked across the aisle and got an appropriation through the entire budget process. And I think it was important to us to see that they found, for one, that this was valuable to them as sitting legislators, because for them it's kind of like free public polling. They spend 30 to 50 grand to poll their districts. So they're not going to do that every year. And they're certainly not going to do it on every bill. They're going to do it maybe once in an election cycle to get a sense from their district of what people's top three priorities are by running a poll or two polls or something like that. And because that's typically all they can afford to do with their campaign funds at the state house level or the state senate level. So they saw the value just as a way to keep the finger on the pulse of their district. And really, it's just a question of getting enough people within their district to actually use it. So you'll see, we've had a few dozen now sitting legislators or candidates endorse the project, saying to their districts, hey, this is a tool you can use to hear from me, and I will be taking this as input when I go to Tallahassee. We had a gentleman go even a step further who's running for US House in Florida's 11th district, a guy named Dan Williams, who's running for Congress, on the premise of going even further and saying, I'll actually vote the way the district tells me to vote on every bill that comes through the process in DC. So I will be almost, he's a college professor who's a technologist himself who teaches computer science in a university setting. He said, okay, my job is now no longer to make the decision for you. It's to explain the legislation, give you as much information as possible, and present both sides factually accurately as possible. Then I'll tell you what my opinion is on what you should do. But ultimately, then I'll leave it to the voters. The voters will vote in the app. And then I will then take what the voters tell me, and that's how I'll vote in Congress. And I thought that's wild. Like, I mean, that's way even further than what we had envisioned, but it's super cool as an idea towards more of a direct democracy, participatory democracy. But it's somewhere on the spectrum of which what legislators which legislators sort of like this idea, which ones think it's crazy. I mean, I've been thrown out of the offices of both Democrats and Republicans, so I carry that as a badge of honor. So, I think it just depends on the individual and their perceptions about their role as a representative and what are their responsibilities and who are they accountable to.
And I think that's a really good example of this. I forget the exact terms for these ideas, but how when we talk about people representing you in office, there's this dichotomy between should they just vote basically how their constituents tell them, or or should they really vote how they really feel, like is their job to vote just according to what their constituents tell them, or do they have to sort of give themselves a level of conscience that says, I truly believe this is the way to go, even if the electorate doesn't agree? I think that's kind of a really interesting example of that kind of philosophical tug, if that makes sense. But nonetheless, that's a really intriguing way to see somebody, go about that on the campaign trail. But let's just say that somebody they hear what Digital Democracy Project's all about. Like, okay, great. They see the statistics. They're like, okay, yeah, that worked for them. But what about for me? So I know you kind of already talked about this, but maybe I don't know, one or two more key examples of specific instances where DDP has helped make government officials more transparent and accountable.
Well, I think it's okay. So if you recall, there was a special election in Central Florida in 2023, where Tom Keene actually flipped a
Right.
district. Yes, so he actually was the first to endorse Digital Democracy Project in his primary, and he was not the party favorite in that primary. There, sort of the party had a different perception of who they were going to go with, and he said, "Well, no, I want to use this technology to be more accountable to voters," and then carried that as part of the campaign message, talked about it at the doors, and it resonated with a lot of people who feel this sense of being shut out of the process. And so he had a surprise victory in that primary, and then ultimately went on to flip the seat in 2023 in an off cycle election. Now, so I think from that standpoint, I think it became clear to us that the demand is obvious amongst voters, that voters wanted a better way, a more accountable way to have a say in their government. Once he was in Tallahassee, he actually did use the results in the app to inform his decision, especially because he was elected in a special election where he didn't come in with the junior class and go through the process like a typical sitting legislator. He came in a week into the session. So he had to like hit the ground running and try to get caught up on all this legislation. Didn't even have a staff assigned yet or anything. So, that I thought was a really interesting use case where he was able to kind of get instant polling from his district that was helpful in informing his decisions in Tallahassee right away. So I think that was the most exciting example for us of seeing it in action. And now it's just a matter of, okay, well, how do we scale it up? How do we go from 24,000 verified voters to 240,000 to 2.4 million to 240 million? We need to be at the point where this basically replaces the need to call your congressman's switchboard or send them an email. I mean, Paul, you've spent enough time in Tallahassee. I sit with legislators sometime. You look at their inbox, and it is almost all astroturf campaigns of people filling out forms on a
Yeah.
website. They can't verify that these people actually live in their district. They mostly just use, I mean, I've been kind of shocked, honestly. Mostly it's like email filtering on a Microsoft Outlook inbox to automatically just dump emails into folders by topics. Like it's crazy. And most of that gets ignored because there's no veracity. And now because a lot of AI generated emails are flooding their inboxes, it's accelerated this problem. So for legislators, I think some of the staff of the House Speaker, I think it was Paul Renner's staff, told me they get like 1,200 emails a day. So how do you even deal with that volume? I mean, the staff can't even keep up with it, and that's their full time job is constituent engagement. So it's it's a tough problem, and so I think putting the verification on the front end is really valuable to legislators. I just think we need to get to the point where it can replace the switchboard. It can replace the email inbox simply because it's a more modern mechanism for engaging with your legislator.
And that's kind of another front of this issue with election security. You just talked about how AI, and obviously we'll talk a bit more about that with your work in AI in general, just how much this is really wreaking havoc on the process. You don't know if these, like you said, if these emails are coming from legitimate people, are these even real voters? And there's all these other things. And then you got to figure out how to sift through, okay, is this legitimate correspondence? And then sometimes you might think you're listening to your actual constituents, but you find out it's actually a bot, and then you actually don't do what your constituents want you to do. And it's just, obviously, it just makes things a lot messier than they are now. So I definitely want to see what DDP is able to do in that regard. And something else with that I really intrigued to hear you talk about with Digital Democracy Project. Something we mentioned in our correspondence was about this issue of participation versus apathy. And I've talked about it on several podcast episodes, especially, and I've written about it before. There's a big thing I stress in my work is how apathy is, while understandable to some extent, it's also a contributor to a lot of the problems we see. So how does DDP help tackle this problem of political apathy?
Right. I think that if we look at the source of apathy, yeah, I think that in my mind, the smoking gun is gerrymandering because the district boundaries have been drawn in such a way that actually intentionally carves out a lot of people from the process. Most legislators don't really, for all intents and purposes, they don't need to represent their districts. What they need to do is represent the interests of the 8 to 10% of voters who will vote in a primary, because their fear of losing a primary challenge is the only thing that keeps them accountable currently. Because if you look at 2024, for example, in Florida, 94% of legislative districts were completely uncompetitive. With not within a 5 percentage point margin of victory, because they're so heavily blue or so heavily red in the way that they're drawn that there really aren't a lot of purple districts left. And we're going to go through another round of that this session to make the federal districts even more gerrymandered potentially.
Yeah.
So the reason voters become apathetic is because they can sense, they don't exactly know why it happens, but they get the feeling that nobody listens to them because nobody's knocking on their doors, nobody's calling them. If you're not a primary voter, you actually don't hear from most election campaigns. By the time the general rolls around, it's mostly locked up. So most legislator or most candidates aren't going to spend a lot of campaign funds turning out people who are not in their core, group. What they want to do is win their primary by focusing on this tiny sliver of the market, if you will, wherein those people get 10 to 12 pieces of literature and dozens of phone calls and text messages because they're primary voters. But then come general election time, it's just to get out the vote amongst those people. Just make sure you turn out your base, and then you're way above the line because the districts are so heavily unbalanced. So I think for a lot of people, a lot of legislators don't hold town halls. That you call their switchboard, it's you get a voicemail, you send an email, you get no response. I just think that people feel like they are speaking into a black hole most of the time, um, and that's in a lot of ways by design.
Yeah, that's another, it's very not entirely overlapping, but still a core part of that accountability is that level of representativeness that we just, we don't see. And like you said, with primaries are really only they're only really accountable to like 8 to 10% of voters, which, yes, they are the most commonly, or they participate the most by far because they're the most ardent partisans. They tend to be more ideological, but you're not getting the entire electorate. You're certainly not getting all the voters that are, general election voters. And then that's not even including people who are either irregular or non-voters who might still want to get involved to some extent, but they just feel like it's a waste of time because they're not going to be listened to anyway. So
Hmm.
yeah, you're only being accountable to a very small segment of the population, which is not, I mean, that's not real accountability. That's just you trying to do whatever you need to appease the people that are going to be the most,
Hmm.
ardent in their advocacy for whatever it is that they're supporting. But that's another really fascinating piece of the puzzle that I can really appreciate you guys are tackling. So I do want to move little bit out of DDP, not entirely out of DDP, because I mentioned your work as an AI consultant outside of the Digital Democracy Project, and you've mentioned it several times. So I want to get a little more on that, especially because there's a lot of apprehension, understandably so, about the improvements in artificial intelligence over the last few years. And there's a lot of people that are unfortunately using it for nefarious purposes, but it also has the power to do a lot of good in the right hands. So how has your work with AI enhanced the cause of transparency and accountability in general? I know you kind of talked about it a little already, but
Hmm.
maybe a little bit more in depth. And does DDP also use AI as well?
Yes, exactly. I understand people's apprehensions about AI. I mean, I do think this is a groundbreaking technology. This is a pivotal shift in human history in a lot of ways. I think it's very similar to the advent of electricity or powered flight or the locomotive. I think it's going to be transformative, and I'm excited about it because I've seen the kind of good we can do with it already. I understand people's fears of job losses or of everything on the internet is fake or AI generated. You can't trust anything. I do completely understand all of those apprehensions. What I would say is AI is a tool. Just like any other tool, it is ultimately down to the human behind it who is using it either for good or for ill. And we have just as much capacity to use it for good as we do to use it for ill. We just have to show people that it can be a tool that, in the right hands and for the right purposes, it can deliver incredible value to us. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have tried to use it initially to lower that cognitive barrier of understanding legislation and public policy more generally. I don't know what's going on in Congress. What are these people doing on my behalf? Or what's going on in Tallahassee? What are these people doing on my behalf? Well, now we have tools that make it so much easier and simpler, not only to understand the framing of the debate, what is it that they're talking about? What legislative policy are they actually proposing to solve the problem that they have identified? And how did my legislator, personally, the guy who represents me, how did he vote or she vote on each of these topics? AI gives us the ability to answer a lot of these questions that took enormous amounts of time and energy to get to before. And another thing, Paul, I mean, you've probably seen this happen over the course of your time as you've spent in Tallahassee. It used to be every local paper would have a journalist in Tallahassee. So I grew up in South Florida reading the Sun Sentinel or the Miami Herald, and they would all have a Tallahassee correspondent, especially during the session, but even off cycle as well. And a lot of those journalists don't exist anymore. They don't have a lot of the local papers don't have the funding to continue to do this. They rely on floridapolitics.com or others bloggers or others to follow this, and then they report because they don't have the money to have full-time staff. I think these tools are in some ways replacing what used to be done by your local paper who would report out what happened in the session. And now you're just not getting that. You're not getting the level of insight that you used to get. And so we have to figure out how to still continue to provide people with the education they need in order to make informed voting decisions.
That the last part you brought up about the newspapers is something that I think about from time to time, not just for the general issues that newspapers have been facing over the past couple decades or so, but one of the jobs I do is a nonpartisan political news aggregator, Safety Review. I don't know if you're familiar with it. SAYFIE, named after Justin Safey, who's
Mm.
was a longtime communications guy. He worked actually for Jeb Bush when he was governor of Florida. And so I've been doing that for in a couple months, it'll be 11 years now. But I
Wow.
do remember when we started it. And for those who don't know, it's a nonpartisan political news aggregator. So every Monday through Thursday morning, and then sometimes I do it during the weekends too, get all the big news stories about Florida politics and political figures all into this one place. I can actually put a link to that in the show notes for safetyreview.com. But anyways, I remember because of what you brought up. I remember when I started out doing that in 2015, right after I graduated from University of South Florida, go Bulls. All the newspapers, or a lot of them were, now there most of them are consolidated within a few companies, especially Gannett has a lot of them. They own Tallahassee Democrat, Naples Daily News, Florida Today, Pensacola News Journal, a whole bunch of other ones. I think they actually have your neck of the woods, Ocala Star Banner. And I remember Star Banner in particular back then just looks, it wasn't under Gannett at that point, but it just looks, even just the look of it, you could see how these websites look so completely different to what they are now. And a lot of those uh, correspondence, like you said, that used to be for each paper's own correspondent in Tallahassee, they just kind of went by the wayside, and now everything's being more consolidated, and you see some of the same stories be shared amongst different newspapers, especially like Gannett's. You'll sometimes see the same article that's from Tallahassee Democrat. It might be in the Palm Beach Post, or how Orlando Sentinel and South Florida Sun Sentinel are under the same umbrella. So you do see a lot more of that consolidation and, usage of similar or same correspondence, and they might have bureaus, but there's, so few papers that can do that now. And it is a shame, but that is really, what you just said makes me really hopeful for what AI can do. And who knows, maybe you can actually start to have more of these local correspondents that can use AI to their advantage, especially with what Digital Democracy Project is doing, and say what they can report on what all of these local and federal elected officials are doing and bring it back to the people there. So I'm really looking forward to see what happens there. But one of the other things, so go ahead.
I'm glad you bring that up, Paul, because I've always had this vision where we could try to have Digital Democracy Project serve as a mechanism for citizen journalists to add to the either to the debate or to the facts of the debate. Yeah, because I think that is a real challenge. Is how do we get good, high quality data? And as I mentioned, we use open states to scrape data from the Florida Senate, Florida House websites. But when you try to get to local level data, if you want to understand what's happening in your municipality or in your county or in your school board, it gets even more difficult to get high quality data at the local level, not only about what policies are being considered, but how did my local city councilman vote on each of these policies? And does it represent, the needs of the community, things like this? It gets tougher and tougher to do the more local you get. And so, having some mechanism for citizen journalism to fill in that gap, I think would be a really important way for us to go forward, because we do see this being incredibly valuable at a local level at some point once we can try to deal with the data quality challenges.
Yeah, that's another great point too. Is for all as obscure as some state governments can be. I mean, local governments, a lot of them you could just forget about learning about them. I've sometimes whenever this kind of thing comes up, I, tell somebody like, I used to work for Ballotpedia, and sometimes I've had to look for local government information and stuff, and I see some of these really local level places that are much smaller counties, and they're their websites look like they're still made with like early 2000s GeoCities, and they're just there's just so, unfortunately there's they're already so obscure, and it's sometimes hard for them to make their information so publicly available for people too.
Right.
So hopefully you talking about that really makes me excited to see where DDP goes from here, which I will ask about shortly. But first, I did want to ask, because we've mentioned several times we're both Floridians. You are also the director of Rank My Vote Florida. Now, obviously, this is for ranked choice voting, but could you go a bit more into detail on what it is you're trying to do for people who are not entirely familiar with ranked choice voting, or if there's something unique about this system that you're going for? And with the general increase in interest in ranked choice voting, how do you see that helping to improve government transparency and accountability?
Right. So ranked choice voting is effectively an instant runoff election. So if you remember, we used to have runoff elections in Florida. I
Mm-hmm.
think the last governor who was elected in a runoff was probably Bob Graham, I want to say. So it's been a while now.
Yeah.
And we got rid of runoff elections because the supervisor of elections found it really difficult to stage an entire new election 30 days after the general election. So as a reminder, basically the way it works in a runoff is if nobody gets above 50% of the election, results, then the top two, whoever's, the top two vote getters, go to a runoff where one of them has to get above 50% in the runoff, and then they win the seat. And what that does is it means that you can't have, it helps prevent the spoiler effect where you have a small, you have a lot of candidates potentially. You have obviously your two main competing candidates, but you have third party candidates, independent candidates that siphon off votes from some of the primary two parties. And then people get people end up feeling like they don't want to vote for an independent or a third party because they're afraid to take votes away from one of the primary parties. With a runoff election, that wasn't as much of a risk because you could vote your conscience. If you wanted to vote for an independent, if you wanted to vote for a third party, you could do that, knowing that, ultimately if they don't win, then the top two vote getters you'll have another chance in the runoff. But the supervisor of elections said, okay, it's very expensive. It's difficult to get the ballots all printed in time. So it's costing the state a lot of time and energy. Let's get rid of runoffs and let's go to plurality voting. And that's the situation we find ourselves in, where you could, if you have, we've seen this happen with presidential primaries, but you could have a dozen people on the ballot and somebody ends up winning with, 25% of the vote. And yeah, you got to ask yourself, like, is that really the best representative for the entire populace? So ranked choice voting is designed to deal with that problem in an instantaneous runoff so that the supervisor of elections don't have to do another whole election. Essentially, you do it at the time of the regular November election. So you just fill out a ballot where instead of just picking who you want to be the next governor, you would just rank the order of the people you like for governor. And then if the person you're most interested in doesn't win, your second choice, your vote goes to your second choice and on down the list. So it's effectively, like I say, it's just a way to bring the runoff process into the November election. I think it's an incredibly powerful structural reform, and it's been used in Ireland for 100 years now. It's not even really that, strange or different. It's just that the the concept is you shouldn't be able to represent a district unless you have more than 50% of the vote. No one should be able to represent the district if they only can speak to a smaller sliver of the electorate. They should be able to speak to at least 50+% of the electorate in order to represent that district. And so ranked choice voting makes legislators more accountable to the entire district, solving this problem we were talking about earlier, where they're currently right now only have to speak to a very hardened group of primary voters, and they don't really need to speak to the entire electorate.
I really am intrigued to see where ranked choice voting goes here, because now it's becoming a bit more high profile. You talk about New York City using it, Alaska having something similar, or do they? Yeah, because I think they have ranked choice.
They do.
General
they
election.
use top five. The way they do it is their primary is an open primary. Anybody can compete. Whoever the top five voters are, top five vote getters. And in their last one, I think they had like 40 people on the ballot and whittled it down to 5. Then of those 5, those go on to the general election, and you can rank them in order 1 through 5.
That's right. That's what it was. That's a more unique version of it. I know there's some different ways that people use, or different places use ranked choice voting. So seeing where that goes is going to be just from a outside point of view, just be really intriguing to see where that goes. Probably should have asked this a little bit earlier, but that's okay. I assume for Digital Democracy Project, this is not going to be the pinnacle of what it's doing. So where do you see DDP in 2, 5, 10 years down the road, especially in terms of where it is used and what it can do?
Right. So our immediate goals this year are to get into all 50 state legislatures, because we started in Florida. This year we expanded. So we covered 7 states this legislative cycle. Arizona legislature will be the one that wraps up in April. Otherwise, the rest of them end in March. And but Arizona, Utah, Michigan, Massachusetts, Virginia, Washington, and Florida. But our goal will be by 2027's legislative session, we're covering all 50 states. We're also covering federal. So Florida voters can actually vote on what's happening in Congress right now, and keep track of how their federal legislators are representing them. Our goal, we've already introduced the ability for all U.S. citizens who are on the voter file in their respective state to get verified for federal congressional, participation. But our goal would be, 2027, it's all 50 states plus federal. And then, like I said earlier, in 3-5 years, we would like to be at the local level. We really would like to be at the point where you can get a sense of what your county is doing or what your school board is doing and weigh in using this technology to have a say in that process. So yes, I mean that we have pretty ambitious goals, and we're a nonprofit. We're all actually volunteering our time to do this. So we see this as a real community effort. This is not something we think is going to be solved by Silicon Valley. This is not something we think is going to be solved by the two political parties. This is something that we think we have to solve as a community of concerned citizens who volunteer time and talent and money to make this work.
It's I know you said it's quite ambitious, but in these kinds of cases, I think you need a little bit of ambition, right? This is something that is so critically needed that it is nice to see somebody push for it and not be shying away from like, well, this is a very tall order, because it is a tall order. It is, I mean, anything that tries to close the ballot information gap is a tall order, but having organizations try to tackle it is always a very heartwarming thing to see, for lack of a better term.
It's a tall order, but I think it's made possible in a way by these technologies where we could not have done this 5 years ago. I'm excited about what is achievable now that was not achievable quite recently. Like the mobile voting software itself wouldn't have been possible without blockchain, without homomorphic encryption, end-to-end verification. All of those are very recent. And then AI, everything we've seen in the last 4 years since ChatGPT became the hottest thing. But our our ability, and then of course what open states has been able to do with scraping data in a habitual way that's easy to consume. But all of this makes possible things that we just could not have imagined before. And it it can make us, it gives us a chance to reimagine a better version of democracy for the 20, and I think be hopeful about a system that is ultimately more accountable to the people. But we have to take the choice to re-engage in our government, to acknowledge our own agency in this system and not be passive bystanders to to the problem that we find ourselves in. I would like to be able to have confidence that my son will grow up in a functioning representative democracy, and not feel like it's going to descend into either authoritarianism or anarchy or pick your boogeyman, where but that he will have the same rights and responsibilities as a citizen that I grew up with. And I think that these types of technologies do give me hope that it is achievable, and it really is now down to the willpower of all of us as voters to make it happen.
Absolutely. And you know what? Since we are coming up on time, I think this is a perfect segue into this next question. And I always like to have at least one question in my interviews that it focus specifically on what people can practically do, any advice that they can actually act upon. So, in general, what are 2 to 3 practical pieces of advice you'd give regular citizens so that they can help improve government accountability and transparency themselves?
Well, look, I mean, I'm going to give a shameless plug. I would love everybody listening to this to go and vote on any piece of legislation that you care about. So
Yeah,
go on to
that's true.
digitaldemocracyproject.org and have your say. Get verified in the app, vote in the app, tell your legislator what you believe. We're actually still in the session right now, so you still have a few more days
Mhm.
before the end of the Florida legislative session, but then Congress is ongoing. We're currently in an active debate right now on should we be at war with Iran? I mean, to me, like this is exactly what we're building this project for. If we're going to commit to another potentially open-ended conflict in the Middle East where American lives and treasure are going to be spent, we ought to, as citizens, have a say in that process. We are the ones who are going to be committing our sons and daughters, or our, brothers and sisters, or our tax dollars to this conflict. We ought to have a say in deciding when to get into war and what to set the terms of engagement, to know when we've achieved our goals, right? I mean, I think that this technology is built for this type of moment, and I only wish that we can move faster so that the next time a president wants to invade a country or start a war, he basically goes to an address, yeah, does a White House address behind the Resolute desk and says to everybody, pull out your phone and let's vote right now on this. And we do it just like, oh, what is it? Oh gosh, the Voice? Is it the Voice
Oh
or
yeah, like Voice, American Idol, all
American
those kinds of
Idol?
singing
Exactly.
competitions. Yeah.
Same concept, right? They've been using this technology for some time. If we can do it for silly reality shows, we ought to be able to do this in a way that it has a real impact on us, on our lives. But to answer your question more specifically, yeah, I would love for people listening to go and vote, to get engaged, to learn about the technology, to educate yourself on the bills and on the policies, use the AI tools to have a chat, to educate yourself on the policies, volunteer. We can always use donations to pay for our server fees and things like that. So please just help us out. If this is the kind of problem that you think you want to help solve, then please engage with us and help us do that.
Yeah, I think that's a very succinct way to put that. And especially with the Iran war and anything like that, whether you agree with it or not, at the very least, we should be having our voices heard because, like you said, we're sending people to potentially die
Mhm.
over in another country. I mean, at the very least, we should have some sort of say where we say, even if you don't ultimately listen to the people, you at least should hear what the people have to say, so that you are ultimately accountable for what happens, anyways, even when you had
Mhm.
all the information in front of you. So, and
Exactly.
I for my podcast, I try to keep myself out of my specific opinion about particular political issues. So it's not a matter of whether I support the war or not, but it is something that people need to be able to have their voice heard about. And uh, I there's really no easy way to transition into this, but since we're running out of time, we're going to go ahead to the random question of the day. So the random question
Mhm.
of the day is something I like to do for those who are new to this. I like to end interviews with a fun, non-political question. I know it's quite a bit of a shift in tone here, but I like to, make things a little bit lighter because sometimes these things can feel very doom and gloom, but it does not always have to be doom and gloom, especially when we're making our voices heard. So, all that being said, for you, Ramon, today's random question of the day is: you get to immediately make one documentary and millions of people will watch it. What is that documentary about? And it doesn't matter if it's a topic that has had a documentary before. Maybe it's just one you want to make specifically.
All right. Well, I'll give you another shameless plug for I wish I had recorded our entire process of building this project. In
Ooh.
retrospect, it would have been nice to record like the team going through trying to figure out what it is we're trying to build and how we're going to stitch it together and record us spending time in Tallahassee talking to legislators. And I think it would have been if we had had a documentary film crew, um you know to not just about the team but about the reaction from a lot of legislators, because like I say, I have been thrown out of people's offices before. That would have been fun to get on camera, especially to understand their rationale,
Yeah.
because some people have accused me of being some sort of stalking horse for Ron DeSantis. Other people have accused me of being like some sort of squishy lib. So I mean, that would have been fun to get on camera. So yeah, I guess that would have been a fun documentary to make, but maybe there's still time, huh?
Yeah.
We got a lot of runway. There are plenty of problems to solve, right? So we're not done yet. We got a lot of work to do still. So maybe that's the one we should be making. Paul.
Yeah, it's just some people are just that averse to being accountable for their decisions, huh?
Hmm.
And unfortunately, that's a problem across the political aisle. I know a lot of people like to think it's just quote unquote the other side, but no, it's a across the political spectrum problem.
Hmm.
Now, for me, there's a whole bunch of different ideas I'd have because I have a bunch of different interests in sports and video games and all this stuff. But maybe for something a little bit more relevant for this, I would pick. I kind of want to do either the development of civics as a or the teaching of civics over the course of American history, or and this I mean this would be like a 50-part series. It'd be like Ken Burns' Vietnam War on steroids. But something I ultimately want to do, later on down the road, is I want to do a political history of all of the states. So all 50 states, because there's, for as fascinating as federal government history is, there is some, there's certain words I could say that I don't want to say on the podcast, but it's insane things that some of these states have had happen in their political history, and just some of the ways that they have just shifted over time. Like, you look at a state like Massachusetts, was as blue as they come, and Vermont is, with the exception of governor lately with Phil Scott, that's a pretty blue state too. Or you look at our state Florida or Texas, that are very red now. 70, 80 years ago, that was not the case at all. Like, I actually remember a couple of years ago, my sister wanted us all to watch it. My sister, my parents, and we watched White Christmas. Just maybe I'm the one of the few people that find this joke really funny, but Danny Kaye's character says something. The context isn't important, but he says, because they're in Vermont, and he says something along the lines of, maybe we'll dig up a Democrat, which is really funny to see now, because it's like, wait, what are you talking about? Vermont's a very Democratic state. This movie's from the 50s. Back then, Vermont was actually quite a Republican state. So, all that to say, though, that just really, I do want to do a book down the road about the political histories of the states and how those shaped over time at the state level, as opposed to
I
just
agree
the
with
federal.
that. I agree with that. I think we in some ways we have made a mistake as a country by centering every political discussion in Washington. And
Yeah.
I think maybe for the first time, Democrats are coming around to the value of states' rights and federalism now that
Yeah.
Trump is in office. Also, along those lines, I think the story about the political transformation of Florida as a result of the pandemic is a very, very interesting historiography that should be analyzed. I think there's been some early work. I forget the professor at a UF who did some of the study, but it's very clear that there was a sizable influx of Republican voters as a result of the pandemic. Now, granted, Republicans have controlled the state house since the mid-90s, but the statewide offices would go back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, and Democrats had a majority of the voter registration. But so there was a trend towards Republicans having greater control over the course of time, which the floodgates opened as a result of the pandemic. And I think that's a really interesting documentary to because it has important ramifications elsewhere in the country. People sort of migrating for politics I don't know that we've really seen that maybe Jim Crow would be the closest example of people leaving the South as a result of Jim Crow, migrating, or the great floods in Mississippi that shifted enormous amounts of African American migration up to Chicago. But otherwise, people leaving the South as a result of Jim Crow, maybe that's the closest equivalent. Otherwise, to think about people engaging in mass migration for political reasons inside the United States, interior, that I think is a really undeveloped thesis for some kind of a documentary. I think would be really interesting to discuss.
Yeah, and it is unfortunate. Well, it's maybe not as much as some people make it out to be. There is this phenomenon where people are moving more and more to places that are like-minded, which I think is quite a shame. I think it's much more interesting to live in a place that is more politically eclectic. And that professor you brought up from University of Florida, I can't say this with certainty. So I did grad school up at University of Florida, but this is a professor that teaches PhD students, not masters. So I'm going to guess that the professor you're talking about is probably Dan Smith, because that is something that he does a lot of. That or Michael McDonald, who I did actually have a class with. It's probably one of those two that did that study you were talking about. But yeah, that's something I've gotten more and more into with this state government, because we just talked about before how a lot of it is sometimes obscure or forgotten by the wayside as people pay attention to the federal level, but state and local level is even more directly impactful on us. But we can go on and on about this all day, but I gotta let you go. And before we go, though, Ramon, obviously I'll share Digital Democracy Project's website, but are there any other links that you want me to share?
No, I think that that's the number one. We'd love to have more of your listeners participating in our project, especially since we started it in Florida. So, fellow Floridians, please keep the party going.
Yeah, absolutely. And for you that are not Floridians, it might already be in your state. And if it's not, it'll be there soon. So, Ramon, really want to thank you for your time. So for my links to wrap things up, my LinkedIn, Facebook, medium.com profile, my website, paulrader.org, my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com, my 5-day education email course about how we can all better depolarize politics and be more effective in that, and some of the mistakes we make and how to correct those, and my book on Amazon about political independence. And I believe that is it from my end. So that is going to wrap things up today for Politics with Paul. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and share with all the people you know. Thank you so much for all of you listening, and we'll see you next time.